that kind of led to this deep-seated belief that I was insignificant to everyone in my life, including God. I just kind of felt like if I disappeared one day, like I didn't even know if anybody would notice.
Camera's rolling, and so this is going to be take 4.
Thea, take 4. Woo. Hi, my name is Thea Jorgenson. I am originally from the East San Francisco Bay Area. Go Giants. I'm not sorry about it. My parents raised my sister and I in the church. I spent a lot of time around people who modeled Jesus really well in Sunday school, in choir practice, at Awana. So I had a really solid foundation to build faith on. I just didn't really utilize it until I was an early teen. So most of my childhood, it just kind of felt like my relationship with Jesus was an extension of my parents. And I also don't know that I necessarily would have called it a relationship. I focused a lot more on the disciplinary parts of it. So I didn't really feel like I personally knew God. I was just kind of like, he's there, but I don't really know him. Then end of 8th grade, I started going to Young Life, and Jesus used that organization to teach me a lot about who he is as a person and like what his characteristics are. And I learned a lot about what it means to have a personal relationship with him through that ministry, which was really helpful going into high school. A week into my freshman year, there was an incident at my church. My middle school pastor left his wife and kids behind and just kind of disappeared at the same time that one of his interns did. And she was a close friend of mine and barely out of high school. They were found together a week later, and when they came back, the church was just kind of like, ooh, that was bad, but we're not going to talk about it anymore. So in the next few months, I experienced a lot of hurt from church leadership and from people that were my friends, but that didn't act very much like I thought that Jesus would in the situation. There was a lot of taking sides and like giving blame. And it also caused a lot of emotional damage that I was not aware of until years and years later. And then it was also just high school, and so cliques started forming in church groups, and despite having been at that church for my whole life and knowing most of the other kids, I somehow didn't fit into any of those groups, and as a 14-year-old girl, that's really demoralizing. So I just kind of started distancing myself from church. And I stopped serving. I leaned really hard into other friendships in my life at school and at Young Life with people who I really loved but who didn't really know Jesus. And so I just felt really alone in my faith. I became guarded and selective. I started to kind of assume the worst about why people were spending time with me. I thought that if somebody wanted to hang out, it was either because they needed something from me or because I had a friend that they wanted to know. I always kind of thought of myself as a second choice friend. That kind of led to this deep-seated belief that I was insignificant to everyone in my life, including God. I didn't see really like how he could use me at all. I just kind of felt like if I disappeared one day, like I didn't even know if anybody would notice. The first time I really was able to identify that feeling was when I worked at a Young Life camp summer after my junior year of high school. So that kind of like allowed me to then start to process through like how to maybe like understand that Jesus saw me differently than that. That summer is also the first time that someone told me that they thought that I focused more on discipline, and so I was like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. Like, I want this to be personal. So my last year at high school, I really tried to focus on like cultivating an actual relationship with Jesus. And then I moved to LA the fall after I graduated to go to CSUN. And that was like the next critical point in my walk with Jesus because I was separated from my family. It was all up to me. I had to decide if I was going to go to church, and if I was going to go, where was I going to go? How often was I going to go, and was I going to be involved? After I moved into the dorms, like 3 days in, I found the local Young Life area, and I called them and I said, hey, what can I do to be involved? God kind of lined it up in a way that I did not expect him to, and allowed me to be a high school leader. So I was leading high school kids while I was still only 18, which technically shouldn't have happened, but that was really, really beneficial for me. It kind of gave me a community in a new place. I ended up finding a church that Jesus used over the next 3 years to really restore my idea of like what church community was supposed to look like. For the first time in a really long time, I felt like people at church cared about me and wanted to know me and wanted to see me grow. I had gotten so used to not talking about the things that had hurt me in the past or like ignoring them because I thought that they were small and they should have been things I could have solved myself. And the small group that I ended up in was like very consistently encouraging in the idea that like I needed to talk about those things and that they were important and that people wanted to hear about them. And Jesus really used that to like allow me to start to love the idea of like being a part of a group at church again. College is also where I had to really learn how to trust Jesus. I had not really faced any uncertainty in my life up until that point. There were a lot of situations that God put me in that I would not have picked to be in myself, and I just kind of had to roll with that and lean into the idea that his ideas were better than mine. One of the biggest examples of that was the summer after my junior year of college. I decided that I wanted to intern at a Young Life camp. And when I applied for a sound tech internship because I was going to school for music, and so I was like, this will be the best of both worlds. I can work at a Young Life camp, but I can also get like practical experience for my resume, and it's gonna be great. So did the interview, it went really well, and then 2 weeks later I got a phone call from her and she was like, would you wanna be the retail intern? Retail was not on my application at all. I feel like I have to do this because God opened this door and allowed me to have this job that I didn't even apply for, so I feel like it'd be really dumb if I didn't try it and see what happened. And I'm so glad I did because that summer changed my life. And as someone who like didn't realize how much emotional damage had been caused in my life by like things that happened, I did not know how much I was gonna need to be working full-time hours with people that were really good at knowing how they felt and were really good at asking other people how they felt. So God used that summer to break down some walls and to be like, hey, look, emotions are not something that you should leave out of this. And I think that that contributed to feeling like I personally knew God because I all of a sudden was like, oh, he wants to know how I'm feeling and he wants to know what my initial reactions are to this thing, and he wants me to talk about that kind of stuff with him instead of it just feeling like emotions were for the people around me but not for my prayers. That really kind of like changed how I saw God and how I talked to him. About a month before I graduated, I was just hit with that uncertainty again because, you know, getting jobs is hard. I just sort of had like a mental break right before I graduated, and I had a friend that was like, hey, maybe you should go to therapy. And I was like, whoa, hold on. Like, I do not have big enough problems to like take up a therapist's time. They could be helping somebody with something so much more necessary than me. So I just kind of sat on the idea for like 3 months. And so I did 6 months of therapy in 2020, and it was way more helpful than I anticipated. I was like, maybe these are some things that I should try and like implement in real relationships, like with actual people at an actual church. But I was not doing that at the time because I sort of gave up on church during the pandemic. I hated watching it virtually. At the beginning of 2021, one of my other Young Life Leader friends who's known me since I moved here just looked at me and said, hey, the only way that you're gonna like really pick a church at this point in like how the world is you're gonna have to join a group and just see how it goes. And that is how I wound up at Story City. Totally a God thing. I found it on Google, and then I was like, well, I guess I'll go to City Life. So I went for a week of City Life. If that hadn't happened during the pandemic, I don't know if I would have like stuck or if I would have been convinced that this was the place that God wanted me to be, because I grew up in really big churches. If I would have known like how small this church was when I first started coming, I think I would have been like, ooh, people are gonna know me and I'm not gonna be able to blend in, and that's scary. So I am actually really grateful that I ended up here when I did, because I just started coming to a small group that had 15 or 20 people in it, and that felt really normal. And I had no frame of reference for how big the rest of the church was, and it has worked out so well. Jesus has used the community here to really teach me how to be vulnerable with people, and like, these people don't know me, and so I have the chance to tell them as much as I want or as little as I want, and I felt like I was safe to do that. Through the community I found here, Jesus has really just affirmed that my story matters and that people do like me just because I'm me and not because of things that I can do for them or things that I can offer to them. I joined the production team last summer, and through that, my idea of church leadership and like what the relationship between church leaders and people that volunteer and people that just go to the church is supposed to be like has been redeemed so much more than I thought that it could be, because I didn't even really know that it needed redeeming until I saw a different dynamic. And I've just felt more intentionally like pushed to learn about Jesus than I have in a really long time. So it's more evident to me now than it ever has been before in my life that like God's timing is good and He has better plans for me than I have for myself, even though sometimes that's really hard for me to believe. So I'm just really thankful for how all of that has worked out.